For years ago, when I married my husband Jake at 27, I thought I had found everything I was looking for in a partner. We had been together for 3 years before getting married, and he seemed to check all the boxes that everyone told me were important in a husband. He was stable, financially responsible, kind to my family, and we rarely fought about anything significant. But now, at 31, I find myself lying awake at night wondering if I made a terrible mistake by marrying someone who I'm increasingly convinced is completely wrong for me, even though he's done nothing particularly wrong to deserve a wife who wants to leave him. The problem isn't that Jake is abusive or unfaithful or even particularly difficult to live with, which makes this situation so much harder because everyone in my life thinks he's wonderful and can't understand why I'm not happy. Instead, the issue is that we seem to be fundamentally incompatible people who want completely different things from life. And I'm starting to realize that love and compatibility aren't the same thing, even though I spent years believing they were. Jake is methodical, practical, and values security above almost everything else, which were qualities I found attractive when we first met because they represented stability I hadn't experienced in previous relationships with more spontaneous, but unreliable partners. He likes routines, predictable schedules, and making decisions based on careful analysis of pros and cons. And he approaches our relationship the same way he approaches his work as a financial advisor, with spreadsheets and long-term planning and logical discussions about optimal outcomes. I, on the other hand, have always been more impulsive and creative, someone who makes decisions based on intuition and feelings rather than data analysis, and who values experiences and personal growth over financial security and predictable outcomes. When we were dating, I thought these differences would complement each other and that Jake would help me become more grounded while I would help him become more adventurous. But instead I feel like I'm slowly disappearing into his version of what our life should look like. The clearest example of this incompatibility emerged last year when I told Jake I wanted to quit my job in corporate communications and start my own freelance writing business, something I had been dreaming about for years, but had never had the courage to pursue. Instead of supporting my entrepreneurial ambitions or even expressing curiosity about what kind of writing I wanted to do, Jake immediately started calculating how much income we would lose and how this decision would affect our ability to save for a house down payment and retirement contributions. He created a detailed spreadsheet showing me exactly how much money we would need in our emergency fund before I could afford to take the risk of leaving my stable job, and he suggested that if I really wanted to write, I should do it as a hobby on weekends while keeping my current position for the financial security it provided. When I tried to explain that I wasn't talking about writing as a hobby, but as a career change that would make me happier and more fulfilled, Jake said that happiness was important, but that financial stability was more important and that I needed to be realistic about our responsibilities. This conversation made me realize that Jake and I have completely different definitions of what it means to build a life together, because while he sees our marriage as a partnership focused on accumulating assets and achieving traditional milestones like homeownership and retirement savings, I see it as an opportunity to support each other's dreams and personal growth, even when those dreams involve some risk or uncertainty. Another major source of tension has been our social life and how we spend our free time, because Jake prefers staying home or seeing the same small group of friends we've known since college, while I'm interested in meeting new people, trying new activities, and generally being more adventurous in how we spend our weekends and vacations. Every time I suggest doing something different, like taking a cooking class or joining a hiking group or traveling somewhere we've never been, Jake asks detailed questions about the cost and time commitment and usually concludes that these activities are unnecessary expenses or time wasters when we could be doing something more productive or familiar. What's particularly frustrating is that Jake doesn't seem to understand that his constant focus on practical considerations makes me feel like he doesn't value the things that are important to me. And when I try to explain this, he gets defensive and says that being practical doesn't mean he doesn't care about my happiness, but that someone has to be the responsible one in our relationship and think about our future security. The issue that has been weighing on me most heavily recently is our different approaches to starting a family, because while we both want children eventually, we have completely different ideas about timing and what it means to be ready for parenthood. Jake has calculated that we should wait another 3 years to start trying for a baby, by which time we'll have saved enough money to buy a house, paid off our student loans, and built up a substantial emergency fund to cover the costs of raising a child. I understand the importance of financial planning, but I'm already 31 and I don't want to wait until I'm 34 to start trying for our first child, especially since there's no guarantee that we'll get pregnant immediately or that we won't face fertility challenges that could take additional time to resolve. When I brought up these concerns, Jake said that I was being emotional rather than logical and that having a baby before we were financially prepared would be irresponsible and potentially harmful to our child's future opportunities. This conversation revealed something that has been bothering me for a while, which is that Jake seems to view my emotions and intuition as problems to be solved rather than valid ways of understanding and responding to situations. He frequently tells me that I'm being too emotional when I express feelings that don't align with his logical analysis, and he seems to believe that his way of thinking is inherently superior to mine rather than just different. Our communication patterns have become increasingly problematic because whenever I try to discuss my unhappiness or concerns about our relationship, Jake responds by asking me to provide specific examples of things he's done wrong, and when I explain that the issue isn't his behavior, but our fundamental incompatibility, he says that's not something that can be fixed because it's too vague and abstract. Last month, I finally told Jake directly that I was feeling unhappy in our marriage and that I thought we needed to consider couples counseling or some other way of addressing our differences before they became insurmountable. His response was to ask me what exactly I wanted him to change about himself, and when I said that I didn't want him to change but that I wanted us to find ways to compromise and support each other's different approaches to life, he said that sounded like I wanted him to become a different person entirely. Jake also pointed out that we rarely fight, that we're financially stable, that we have a nice apartment and good jobs and supportive families, and that most people would consider us lucky to have such a stable and peaceful relationship. He asked me what more I could possibly want, and when I tried to explain that I felt like we were living parallel lives rather than building something together, he said that I had unrealistic expectations about marriage and that I was looking for problems where none existed. The conversation ended with Jake suggesting that maybe I was going through some kind of early midlife crisis and that I should talk to a therapist about my dissatisfaction with my life, rather than blaming our marriage for problems that were really about my own unrealistic expectations and inability to appreciate what we had built together. This response made me realize that Jake genuinely doesn't understand what I'm trying to communicate to him, and that he views my unhappiness as a personal failing rather than a signal that something important is missing from our relationship. It also made me wonder if he's right, and I am just someone who will never be satisfied with a good, stable life because I'm always looking for something more exciting or fulfilling. Since that conversation, I've been doing a lot of soul searching and trying to figure out whether my feelings represent valid concerns about our compatibility or unrealistic expectations that are preventing me from appreciating a good marriage. I've been reading books about relationships and marriage, talking to friends and family members, and even considering individual therapy to get clarity about what I really want and whether it's reasonable to expect those things from a marriage. What I keep coming back to is that while Jake is a good person who would make an excellent husband for someone who shares his values and approaches to life, I don't think that person is me, and I don't think I'm the right wife for him either. We make each other feel bad about who we are because he makes me feel like I'm irresponsible and unrealistic, while I make him feel like nothing he does is good enough, and that his way of approaching life is somehow wronged. The problem is that recognizing this incompatibility doesn't make the decision to leave any easier, because Jake hasn't done anything wrong, and because we have built a life together that includes shared finances, shared friends, shared living space, and shared future plans that would be complicated and painful to untangle. I also worry that I'm making a huge mistake by walking away from a stable, loving relationship because I have some fantasy about finding someone who's more compatible with my personality and values. I'm also terrified about the practical aspects of starting over at 31 because dating again sounds exhausting and scary, and there's no guarantee that I'll find someone better suited to me or that I'll find anyone at all. What if I leave Jake and spend the next 10 years alone, eventually realizing that I gave up something valuable for something that doesn't actually exist? My family and friends think Jake is wonderful and that I should be grateful to have such a stable, responsible husband, especially given how many women struggle to find reliable partners. They keep telling me that marriage requires compromise and that I shouldn't expect to be happy and fulfilled all the time, and that my dissatisfaction probably stems from unrealistic expectations rather than genuine incompatibility. But I feel like there's a difference between normal relationship challenges and fundamental differences in values and life approaches that make two people wrong for each other, even if they care about each other and want each other to be happy. I also think there's a difference between compromising on small things and compromising on the core aspects of who you are and what you want from life. I've been considering suggesting a trial separation to give us both space to think about what we really want and whether we can find ways to bridge our differences, but I'm worried that Jake will see this as me giving up on our marriage rather than trying to save it, and I'm also worried that time apart will just confirm what I already suspect, which is that we're better as friends than as spouses. The hardest part is that I do love Jake and I don't want to hurt him, especially since he seems genuinely happy with our relationship and doesn't understand why I'm not satisfied with what we have. I also don't want to waste more years of both our lives if we're fundamentally incompatible because he deserves to be with someone who appreciates his approach to life, and I deserve to be with someone who values the things that are important to me. I guess what I'm really asking is whether anyone else has been in a similar situation where they had to choose between staying in a good relationship that wasn't right for them or leaving to find something better that might not exist. How do you know when to keep trying to make something work versus when to accept that two people can love each other but still be wrong for each other? Update 1. I wanted to update everyone who responded to my original post because the situation has developed in ways I didn't expect, and I'm hoping to get some additional perspective on the decisions I've made and the challenges that have emerged since I first wrote about my marriage struggles. After reading through all of your thoughtful responses, I decided to have another serious conversation with Jake about my concerns, but this time I was more direct about the possibility that we might be fundamentally incompatible rather than just going through a rough patch that could be resolved with better communication or compromised. I told Jake that I had been doing a lot of thinking about our relationship and that I was concerned we wanted different things from life in ways that might not be reconcilable through normal relationship problem solving. I explained that while I respected his practical approach to decision-making and financial planning, I felt like my more intuitive and emotionally driven approach to life was being dismissed or treated as less valid, and that this dynamic was making me feel like I was losing important parts of myself. Jake's initial response was similar to our previous conversations, where he focused on the practical aspects of our relationship and pointed out all the ways we were successful as a couple, including our financial stability, our lack of serious conflict, and our shared long-term goals around homeownership and family planning. He said that he didn't understand why I was so focused on our differences when we agreed on most of the important things and rarely had serious disagreements. But when I pressed him about whether he was truly happy with our relationship or just satisfied with its stability and predictability, Jake admitted that he had been feeling frustrated with what he called my constant dissatisfaction and tendency to create problems where none existed. He said that he felt like nothing he did was good enough for me and that I was always looking for something more exciting or dramatic than what we had built together. This conversation helped me realize that Jake was just as unhappy with our dynamic as I was, even though he had been focusing on the practical benefits of our relationship rather than acknowledging his emotional dissatisfaction. He felt like I was constantly criticizing his approach to life and making him feel like he was boring or inadequate, while I felt like he was dismissing my emotional needs and treating my desire for more spontaneity and adventure as character flaws. We decided to try couples counseling, which was something I had suggested before, but Jake had been resistant to because he didn't think our problems were serious enough to require professional intervention. The counselor we started seeing has been helpful in creating a space for us to communicate more openly about our differences without immediately trying to solve or dismiss each other's concerns. What emerged from our first few sessions was that both of us had been trying to change the other person rather than accepting that we might simply be incompatible in some fundamental ways. Jake had been hoping that I would eventually become more practical and less focused on what he saw as abstract concerns about fulfillment and personal growth, while I had been hoping that he would become more open to spontaneity and more supportive of my emotional needs. The counselor helped us understand that neither of these changes was likely to happen in any lasting way, and that the question we needed to answer was whether we could find ways to appreciate and support each other's different approaches to life without trying to convert each other to our own worldview. We've been working on this for about 2 months now, and while our communication has improved and we've both become more aware of how our different styles affect each other, I'm still not convinced that awareness alone is enough to bridge the gap between what we each need from a relationship. For example, we've been trying to compromise on decision-making by agreeing that I can pursue my freelance writing business as long as I maintain my current job part-time for financial security, and Jake has agreed to try one new activity each month that I choose, even if it seems impractical or expensive to him. These compromises have reduced some of the tension between us, but they still feel like we're managing our differences rather than truly resolving them. I also realize that I'm still not excited about building a life with Jake, even though I appreciate his efforts to understand my perspective and accommodate my needs. The thought of continuing to negotiate and compromise on these fundamental differences for the next 30 years feels exhausting rather than hopeful, and I'm starting to think that love and effort might not be enough to overcome basic incompatibility. Jake seems more optimistic about our progress in counseling, and he's been making genuine efforts to be more supportive of my career goals and more open to trying new experiences. But I can tell that these changes don't come naturally to him, and that he's doing them because he wants to save our marriage rather than because he's genuinely excited about becoming a more adventurous person. Similarly, I've been trying to be more appreciative of Jake's practical approach to life and to see his financial planning and risk-averse decision-making as caring rather than controlling. But I still feel constrained by his need for security and predictability, and I still find myself wishing I was with someone who shared my enthusiasm for taking risks and trying new things. I'm planning to continue with counseling for at least another month or two because I want to make sure I'm giving our marriage every possible chance to succeed. But I'm also starting to accept that sometimes two people can love each other and work hard to make their relationship better without being able to overcome fundamental differences in how they approach life. The hardest part is that Jake is a good person who deserves to be with someone who truly appreciates his strengths rather than someone who sees them as limitations. And I deserve to be with someone who values the things that are important to me rather than someone who tolerates them as quirks or flaws. I'll update again after we've had more time to work through this process. But I wanted to let everyone know that your advice about the importance of compatibility versus love has been really helpful in understanding what we're dealing with. Update 2. It's been about 6 weeks since my last update, and I wanted to share what's been happening with our marriage counseling and the decision I've made about our relationship, because the situation has evolved in ways that have been both clarifying and heartbreaking. As I mentioned before, Jake and I had been working with a counselor to try to bridge our differences and find ways to appreciate each other's approaches to life without trying to change each other fundamentally. For a while, this seemed to be helping, and we were both making efforts to understand each other's perspectives and accommodate each other's needs through various compromises and agreements. Jake had been more supportive of my career goals and had agreed to try new activities and experiences that I suggested, even when they seemed impractical or expensive to him. I had been making an effort to appreciate his financial planning and security-focused approach to decision-making, and to see his practical concerns as expressions of care rather than attempts to control or limit me. However, what became clear over time was that while we were both capable of modifying our behavior and being more considerate of each other's needs, we couldn't change our fundamental values and priorities, and the effort required to constantly accommodate each other's different approaches to life was exhausting for both of us. The turning point came about 3 weeks ago when we had a session where our counselor asked us each to describe what we envisioned for our lives in 5 years, and our answers revealed just how different our dreams and priorities really were. Jake described a life focused on financial security, home ownership, starting a family according to a carefully planned timeline, and building a stable, predictable routine that would allow us to provide for our children's future and prepare for retirement. I described a life focused on creative fulfillment, travel, new experiences, and raising children who were encouraged to take risks and follow their passions rather than prioritizing security above all else. When our counselor asked us to find common ground between these visions, we both struggled to identify areas where our priorities aligned rather than conflicted. What was particularly revealing was that neither of us seemed excited about the other person's vision for our future, and both of us seemed to view the other's priorities as obstacles to what we really wanted rather than as equally valid approaches to building a meaningful life. After that session, Jake and I had a long conversation at home where we both admitted that while we loved each other and wanted each other to be happy, we were starting to realize that we might be preventing each other from building the kinds of lives we really wanted by staying together and trying to compromise on things that were too important to compromise on. Jake told me that he had been feeling anxious and stressed about my desire for more spontaneity and risk-taking, and that he worried constantly about financial security and planning for our future in ways that he didn't think I understood or appreciated. He said that while he was willing to try new things and support my career goals, he didn't think he would ever be truly comfortable with a level of uncertainty and adventure that seemed to be important to me. I told Jake that while I appreciated his efforts to be more flexible and adventurous, I felt like I was asking him to be someone he wasn't, and that I was also compromising on things that were fundamental to who I was and what I wanted from life. I said that I didn't want him to change into someone else for my sake, but that I also didn't want to spend the rest of my life feeling like I was being held back from pursuing the things that excited me. We both acknowledged that this wasn't about either of us being wrong or bad people, but about us being genuinely incompatible in ways that couldn't be resolved through better communication or increased effort. Jake said that he thought we had both been trying to force something that wasn't meant to work, and that maybe the loving thing to do would be to let each other go find partners who are better suited to our different approaches to life. This conversation was one of the most difficult and sad discussions I've ever had, because it involved accepting that love isn't always enough to make a relationship work, and that sometimes two people can care deeply about each other while still being wrong for each other in fundamental ways. We decided to take a break from counseling and spend some time apart to think about whether we wanted to continue trying to make our marriage work or whether we should start the process of separating and eventually divorcing. Jake has been staying with his brother for the past 2 weeks, and I've been using this time to think about what I really want and whether I'm prepared to end my marriage for the possibility of finding something better. What I've realized during this time apart is that while I miss Jake and feel sad about the end of our relationship, I also feel relieved not to be constantly negotiating and compromising on things that are important to me. I've been able to make decisions about how to spend my time and money without having to justify them or argue about their practicality, and I've been able to pursue my writing and other interests without feeling like I'm being selfish or irresponsible. I've also been able to imagine a future where I'm with someone who shares my enthusiasm for adventure and creativity and who sees my spontaneity and willingness to take risks as strengths rather than problems to be managed. While I know there's no guarantee that I'll find that person, I've realized that I'd rather be alone than continue to feel like I'm compromising on core aspects of who I am. Jake and I are planning to have another conversation this weekend about whether we want to try to continue our marriage or whether we should start the process of separating permanently. I'm going into that conversation with the understanding that while I love Jake and will always care about him, I don't think we can build the kinds of lives we each want while staying together. I know that many people will think I'm making a mistake by leaving a stable, loving relationship for uncertain possibilities, but I've come to believe that staying in a relationship that requires both people to compromise on fundamental aspects of who they are isn't fair to either person, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let each other go. I'll update again after Jake and I have had our conversation and made our final decision about our marriage. Update 3. I wanted to provide what will likely be my final update on this situation, because Jake and I have made our decision about our marriage, and while it's been incredibly difficult and painful, I believe we've chosen the path that will ultimately be best for both of us. As I mentioned in my previous update, Jake and I had planned to have a conversation about whether we wanted to continue trying to make our marriage work or whether we should begin the process of separating permanently. That conversation took place this past Saturday, and it was one of the most honest and heartbreaking discussions I've ever had. We met at a coffee shop near our apartment because we both felt like neutral territory would help us stay focused on making the best decision rather than getting caught up in the emotional weight of ending our marriage in the home we had shared for the past 2 years. Jake started the conversation by telling me that he had spent the past 2 weeks thinking about our relationship and about what he wanted from his life, and that he had come to some conclusions that were difficult but important for him to share. He said that while he loved me and valued our relationship, he had realized that he had been spending so much energy trying to accommodate my needs and interests that he had lost sight of his own priorities and values. He explained that he had been feeling anxious and stressed about money and planning for our future in ways that were affecting his sleep and his ability to enjoy his work and other activities, and that he didn't think this was healthy or sustainable for either of us. Jake said that he needed to be with someone who shared his focus on financial security and long-term planning, and who didn't make him feel like his practical approach to life was boring or inadequate. I told Jake that I had reached a similar conclusion, which was that while I loved him and appreciated his many wonderful qualities, I had been feeling constrained and frustrated by our different approaches to decision-making and risk-taking, and that I didn't think I could be truly happy in a relationship where I felt like I was constantly having to justify my desire for adventure and creative fulfillment. What was remarkable about this conversation was how aligned we were in our understanding of the situation, even though it was painful for both of us to admit that our marriage wasn't working despite our love for each other and our efforts to make it succeed. We both acknowledged that we had been trying to change each other rather than accepting that we were fundamentally incompatible, and that this dynamic had been unfair to both of us. Jake said that he wanted me to be able to pursue my writing career and travel and take risks without feeling like I was being held back by his need for security and predictability. I told him that I wanted him to be able to focus on building the stable, financially secure life he valued, without feeling like he was being criticized or pressured to be more spontaneous and adventurous. We spent about 3 hours talking through the practical aspects of separating, including how we would handle our lease, our shared belongings, and our finances. While these conversations were difficult, they were also relatively straightforward because we both wanted to be fair to each other and to make the transition as smooth as possible. What was much harder was talking about the emotional aspects of ending our marriage, because despite our incompatibility, we do care deeply about each other and want each other to be happy. Jake told me that he hoped I would find someone who appreciated my creativity and spontaneity, and that he was sorry he hadn't been able to be that person for me. I told him that I hoped he would find someone who shared his values around financial planning and stability, and that I was sorry I hadn't been able to appreciate those qualities in the way he deserved. We both acknowledged that we had learned important things about ourselves and about relationships through our marriage, even though it was ending, and that we didn't regret the time we had spent together or the efforts we had made to try to make it work. The divorce process has been surprisingly amicable, partly because we both agree that this is the right decision, and partly because we're both committed to treating each other with respect and kindness even as we end our marriage. We've agreed to use a mediator rather than hiring separate attorneys, which should make the process faster and less expensive, and we've been able to reach agreements about dividing our assets and debts without significant conflict. I moved out of our shared apartment last week, and I'm currently staying with my sister while I look for my own place. It's been strange and sad to pack up 4 years of shared belongings and to say goodbye to the home we created together, but it's also been liberating in ways I didn't expect. For the first time in years, I feel like I can make decisions about my future without having to consider how they'll affect someone else's need for security and predictability. I've already started the process of transitioning to freelance writing full-time, something I probably would have continued postponing indefinitely if I had stayed married to Jake because of his concerns about financial stability. I've also been thinking about travel opportunities and other experiences I want to pursue, and while it's scary to be making these plans alone, it's also exciting to feel like I'm finally building the kind of life I've always wanted rather than the compromised version we had been trying to create together. Jake seems to be adjusting well to our separation, and he's already started talking about his plans to buy a house and focus on his career advancement now that he doesn't have to worry about accommodating my less practical interests. While it's somewhat painful to hear how relieved he seems to be able to focus on his own priorities, I'm also glad that he's feeling optimistic about his future. We've agreed to have minimal contact while we both adjust to being single again, but we've left the door open to potentially being friends in the future once we've had time to heal from the end of our marriage and build our separate lives. Looking back on this whole experience, I'm grateful for the clarity that came from really examining what we each wanted from life and being honest about our incompatibilities rather than continuing to try to force something that wasn't working. While divorce wasn't the outcome I had hoped for when I first started questioning our marriage, I think it was the right decision for both of us. I also feel like I've learned important lessons about the difference between love and compatibility, and about the importance of being with someone who values the same things you do rather than someone who just tolerates your differences. Jake is a wonderful person who will make an excellent husband for someone who shares his approach to life, but that person isn't me, and I'm finally at peace with that reality. To anyone else who might be in a similar situation, questioning whether love is enough to overcome fundamental differences in values and life priorities, I would say that it's worth taking the time to really examine what you need from a relationship and whether you're getting those things from your current partner. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is admit that you're not right for each other and let each other go find better matches. It's been a difficult and painful process, but I'm optimistic about the future and excited to see what kind of life I can build now that I'm free to pursue the things that are most important to me. Thank you to everyone who offered advice and support throughout this journey. Your perspectives were incredibly helpful in giving me the courage to make this difficult decision.